his position, like I said. So it's all going off. James, what's your view of the sleaze that is unfolding in front of our eyes?
Morning, Andrew.
Morning.
I'd just like to say that it's Conservatives 101. This is exactly what they do. They revert to type. This is what they've been known for throughout their entire sort of 20th century history, at least. Just sleaze. Total and utter sleaze.
Have you got any idea where the 37 billion quid has gone to?
I would love to know where the 37 billion quid has gone to.
Can you believe that we... Where have you ever lost 37 billion quid?
No. I think it's safe to say I haven't.
Unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, I just sort of put that out earlier on. Do you know where lithium comes from?
China? Isn't it mined from China?
I don't know. I've got a lady called Marlene has just said it comes from the Congo and Afghanistan. And then I've got somebody
that's
else.
right. Afghanistan. Yeah, Afghanistan. The mines in Afghanistan. That's why we were there in the first place.
And then Pat says Afghanistan has the largest amount of lithium. Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you very much indeed.
Cheers,
for that.
Thank you.
All the best to you, James. Good to speak with you. That's it from me. I shall do more chatting with you, hopefully, if you call in next weekend breakfast between 7 and 10 a.m. on a Saturday and a Sunday. Thank you very much indeed for your calls both today and yesterday morning. Coming up at 1 this afternoon, it's Majid Nawaz right now on LBC and live from Westminster. Here's Tom.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Yes, morning all. Welcome to the show. At 10 o'clock.
It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure.
I think it's been a lot of talking about changes needed, but nothing happens.
Thousands take to the streets to protest climate inaction as COP26 reaches half-time in Glasgow.
And we know that this COP26, is our last best hope to keep 1.5 in reach.
Pledges to cut methane, provide cash and halt deforestation are being lauded, but more will be needed to keep 1.5 alive. Now, a suggestion that landlords will be barred from renting out properties that fall below energy efficiency targets. Is that the kind of state intervention needed to help save the planet? Do you care if people object?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 10 o'clock. Labour is calling for the Prime Minister to resign over his handling of the Owen Paterson lobbying row. Last week, Conservative MPs tried to overhaul the disciplinary process instead of suspending the now former minister before backtracking on their vote. Environment Secretary George Eustace admits they made a mistake trying to bring about changes as they did, but describes it as a Westminster storm in a teacup. But Shadow Leader of the House, Labour's Tangam Debonair, says it leaves Boris Johnson and her opposite number, Jacob Rees-Mogg, in an untenable position.
I feel it leaves the government with its reputation in tatters. There's a pattern of behaviour. If we go back to the illegal prorogation of Parliament, for instance, that was an astonishing thing for any lawmaker to support, let alone the Prime Minister to lead on. We are lawmakers. We should not be lawbreakers.
Investigations are continuing into what led to 8 people to die at a music festival in the United States. Police inquiries are centring on reports of a person injecting others with drugs. The youngest victims were 14 and 16 years old. A British man has been charged after being arrested in Ireland on suspicion of making threats to kill a Westminster MP. It's understood the person targeted was a female Labour politician. Travel firm Expedia has stopped selling holidays with captive dolphin and whale performances after adjusting its animal welfare policy. However, it says it will offer what it describes as seaside sanctuaries that provide captive animals with a permanent seaside living environment. The Health Secretary is urging more people to get their booster coronavirus vaccines ahead of Christmas. Sajid Javid says they'll help stop restrictions being reimposed over the festive period in England. From tomorrow, 3 million more people in the nation will be invited to receive their third dose. Dr. Rakib Ali from University of Cambridge says it makes sense.
Over Christmas, there's more mixing that goes on. So I think the aim should be to get all over 50s having their booster shots by just at least a couple of weeks before the Christmas break.
Founding member of UB40 Astro, real name Terence Wilson, has died after a short illness at the age of 64. The band say they are absolutely devastated and completely heartbroken. Our entertainment reporter Kevin Hughes has more.
Astro was one of the founding members of UB40, who of course broke through in the late 1970s. The working class boys from Birmingham, a multiracial lineup who went on to enjoy 2 American #1 singles with the iconic Red Red Wine, Can't Help Falling in Love with You, 2 UK #1 singles, and dominated the music landscape for the next 2 decades.
An early season snowstorm in China has led to flight and train cancellations and road closures. It fell in the capital Beijing and nearby cities. An orange weather alert has been issued in China, the country's second highest level in its 4-tier warning system. The weather, windy with severe gales across the northern and eastern parts of Scotland, showers easing in the far north, sunny spells elsewhere, a high of 12 degrees Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Philip Chrysikos.
There's
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
just gone 10. Hello, good morning. Welcome to the show. You're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday. I'm Tom Swarbrick. Hope we find you very well this morning. Coming up,
a man had crawled all over her skin, and there's me kissing and cuddling and saying my last goodbyes.
calls for an independent inquiry into how a hospital electrician could have been missed after spending years sexually abusing dead bodies. It is a truly horrific case. We'll get reaction. Also,
I think a mistake certainly was made, and I think rather a bad mistake. There's a general whiff of "we are the masters now" about their behaviour.
John Major doesn't like Boris Johnson is hardly news these days, but the former PM sums up the anger of many Conservative MPs at the end of an unedifying authority-shredding week for Downing Street. Details to come.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good morning to you. This week, Boris Johnson evoked Ron Manager at the COP26 summit the other day. The bumbling, largely nonsensical figure who is regularly never across the details resembled the Far Show character by messing up a footballing analogy.
If this was a football match, then the current score would be 5-1 down in the match between humanity and climate change. And I think what you could say today, after 2 days of talks with around 120 world leaders, is that we've pulled back a goal, or perhaps even 2. And I think we're going to be able to take this thing to extra time, because there's no doubt that some progress has been made.
It's just not football. Nevertheless, half-time has been reached in this confusing fight back, with the prospect of keeping 1.5 alive. A raft of agreements have been signed by major powers, including on methane reduction, deforestation commitments and billions of dollars for poorer countries. Other than Joe Biden reportedly breaking wind in earshot and maybe even no shot of the Duchess of Cornwall, things seem to be heading in the right direction. Heading onto the streets yesterday were tens of thousands who were demanding more action faster. If you were there, give us a ring. The Prime Minister has talked about the invisible hand of the market driving a lot of the change necessary to be net zero by 2050. But this is also going to require massive amounts of state intervention. We read this weekend that landlords will be barred from renting out properties that fall below emissions targets. It's reported that the government is poised to announce legislation which will require all privately rented homes to be rated EPC-C, the third highest level of energy efficiency. Those who let out homes that do not meet that target will face fines of up to 15 grand, it's reported. I wonder whether you think that's part of what is just going to be required to get to net zero, the state setting different rules for the private sector to guide or even push it to being much more energy efficient. Who wouldn't want to live in a more energy efficient home? If you're the landlord, I wonder whether you agree that this is ultimately the right thing to do. You might grumble about having to pay the costs, but then your tenants will be grumbling even more loudly in a colder, leakier, less well-insulated home. Are these the kind of changes we need to be forced to make in order to save the planet? I wonder whether you think it goes far enough. Why not extend the requirement for energy efficiency levels to perhaps the sale of all homes? 0345 6060 973. Up in Glasgow at this half-time of the COP26 summit is George Eustace, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Conservative MP for Camborne and Redruth. I asked him earlier about what he would say to Greta Thunberg, the climate activist who suggests that COP has already been a failure.
Well, look, I don't agree with her, and obviously she was saying this before it even started. There's still a week to go. It hasn't finished. There's been some really positive announcements this week. We've now got around 90% of the world's economy committed to net zero by the middle of the century. A really big step forward on forests as well, with 120 countries, including countries like Brazil and Russia and China, coming together to say that they're going to halt deforestation by 2030, and some funding to underpin these pledges. So, look, I've met a lot of young people that have been involved in the conference, speaking on panels. I don't think we should assume that Greta Thunberg represents all youth opinion on this. Some have been
Does she
quite
frustrate you? Does that attitude frustrate you?
Well, look, there will always be protesters who, whatever's done, will say it's not enough. And I think it's wrong to be cynical in that way. I think the right thing to do is to work through that difficult diplomacy of a multilateral agreement. That's what we've been doing over the last year in the run-up to COP. And I think we've got some good, solid commitments to show for it so far, but more we're hoping to achieve before the end.
Cynical might be the term used to describe some of the language about the position that humanity is in. 1 minute to midnight, the Archbishop of Canterbury making comparisons to genocide. I wonder what you make of some of the language around the threats that we face. Do you think it's too much?
Well, look, my personal view on this is that climate change is a really big challenge. I've been on panel discussions during the course of this week with some of the sort of Pacific Island states, atoll states and so forth, who, for whom it really is an existential threat, because rising sea levels, are obviously going to mean the loss of much of their territory. So the threats are real. The extreme weather events that we're seeing increasingly are real. We know that if water temperatures and ocean temperatures rise as projected, and if we do nothing, then there will be major impacts on delicate ecosystems like coral reefs. So yes, this is a really big global challenge, but my own view is you also need to give people hope. If there's too much doom and gloom, people just zone out and assume that nothing can be done. So you've got to point to the progress we've made, and here in the UK we've cut our carbon emissions by 40%. Recognise there's more to do, but you've got to give people hope as well as get them to recognise the urgency of it.
Yes, let's come on to what it is you might be asking people in this country to do in order to reach this target of net zero by 2050. Are you going to want to force landlords to get an EPC C rating before they can rent out a property?
We're looking at all sorts of different policy issues. There's already been a requirement to get an energy report for landlords wanting to rent out. That's been around for about 20 years. I know that this is an area, though, that obviously we're looking at since basically the issue of boilers and how we domestically heat houses is a big challenge.
So this idea of putting that into legislation, making it law that you would have to have a C rating on your EPC before you could rent it out, that's being looked at.
Well, I'm not aware. I haven't heard that particular proposal. But what I would say is that we don't rule anything out. And there are challenges, with increasing that renting, because it means you potentially could remove some older housing stock from the rental market, and that would obviously not be a good thing to do. So we want to improve the energy efficiency rating of some of those older homes. But we've got to also be very mindful of the impacts that there might be.
Yeah,
I wonder where we already have something of a housing crisis.
Yes, quite. I wonder if energy efficiency would ever be a condition of selling a property. That if you own a home that has an EPC rating below, say, D or whatever is decided upon, you wouldn't be allowed to sell it until it reached that level.
Well, again, with all of these sorts of proposals, you always have to be conscious of unintended consequences. And if you prevent people from selling a property that a new purchaser might invest in and might make the necessary changes to, again, that wouldn't necessarily be a smart move. So these are complex areas. You need to make sure that you have a good functioning rental market, that you have sufficient homes on the rental market, and that you don't have unintended consequences by putting in place.
But is it being looked at? Are those the kinds of areas that your colleagues, cabinet ministers, others, you yourself, you're looking at saying, well, what can we do in this area to make it better for the climate, for people to only be able to sell homes if they've got it up to scratch energy-wise?
Well, I've not seen that specific proposal, but what I do know is that all things are being looked at because actually fossil fuels, gas boilers in homes remains a major part of our carbon emissions. And once we've moved to electrification of the transport network, working on homes and how we can replace that gas with something else starts to become more important.
Does any of the polling around this worry you at all? I see there's a poll today, less than half of the population is willing to pay thousands to make their homes greener. Does it concern you about the gap between the rhetoric and the ask versus the reality for a lot of people, which is they just can't afford it?
Well, obviously, you always have to weigh that up as you move forward with these things. And it's why, actually, a lot of the answers are in technology. And once you've perfected the technology, getting the cost to fall so that it stops to be something that is a major new burden, a major new cost on household incomes, on public finances. But actually, the technology gets to the point that it doesn't cost any more, but it's greener and has far lower carbon emissions. And that's where we're seeking to get with a lot of these things. We've seen it, for instance, on offshore wind, which just a decade ago was incredibly expensive. The cost has now fallen and it's now a cheap form of electricity.
I realise you're running off to COP26, so we won't keep you too much longer, but I have to turn to other matters. I wonder whether you agree that Catherine Stone, the Standards Commissioner, should consider her position.
Well, I don't think so. It's look, she's there as carrying out a role that. Sorry, Tom. Can you hear with the wind?
Yes, that's all right. We've got that.
Look, Catherine, I don't think so. I mean, basically, and that's not what we've suggested. What we've been suggesting is that we should have an appeals process. The real issue here is, where the Committee on Standards get something and somebody wants a right of appeal, a chance to make their case, they should be able to do so.
Although, to be fair, your cabinet colleague Kwasi Kwarteng did absolutely make that suggestion. He said earlier in the week, I think it's difficult to see what the future of the commissioner is, given the fact we're reviewing the process and we're overturning and trying to reform this whole process. She should consider her position. Is that still the view of the cabinet, the view of the government?
Well, what we were trying to do is just bring into effect an appeals process. It wasn't actually to turn over the existing one. It was to introduce an appeal, and that's still our view that that's the right thing to do.
On what grounds, then, did Kwasi Kwarteng suggest that the Standards Commissioner should review her position?
Well, I think he wasn't talking about her personal position from what you've just read out. That would seem to me that the context in which you said that, he was saying that it's at this stage difficult to say precisely how that would fit into a new regime.
No, he said, I think it's difficult. Sorry to interrupt. I think it's difficult to see what the future of the Commissioner, Catherine Stone, is.
Well, I don't think that he named her personally. So I think
who else
he was
is the
talking
Commissioner?
Well, I think he was talking about how the role of a commissioner would fit in in a new process where you had an appeals. So I don't think he was calling on her to consider her position in the sense of resigning. I think he was talking about the overall structure and setup of the appeals process.
Is the Prime Minister happy with Catherine Stone in her job?
Look, as I said, it's not really for any member of Parliament or Prime Minister or Minister to be happy or otherwise. She's there to do an independent role, and she reports obviously to a committee on parliamentary standards.
Well, one wonders then why a cabinet colleague of yours suggested that she might have to consider her position. Why are the Prime Minister's instincts?
Well, as I just said, I think what he was saying is that the role of the commissioner. He wasn't saying she should consider her position. He was saying we would need to think about how the overall role of a commissioner, whoever the occupant of that might be, would fit into a new system.
This has all been handled shambolically, hasn't it?
Well, look, we introduced an amendment to try to bring forward an appeals process. In the end, the Labour Party and the other opposition parties said that they weren't willing to engage in that at this stage because they feared it was conflated with
Secretary of State. I mean, it's a valiant attempt at a defence, but really, this whole thing was created in the Whip's office, put through the Leader of the Commons office, and signed off by Number 10. It's a problem entirely of the Conservative government's own making.
Well, look, we've been very clear that with hindsight, yes, it was an error to bring that forward in the way that we did because there was a danger that it would get conflated with the Owen Paterson case. But it was right to try to establish an appeals process. We still think that's the right thing to do. There's a debate on Monday, and we hope to have cross-party talks on how to introduce such an appeal in future.
Very, very finally, I will let you go. I don't know whether you've had sight of this case of David Fuller. Absolutely shocking and disgusting. Do you think there should be an independent inquiry into how David Fuller was allowed to sexually abuse dead bodies in hospitals?
I'm afraid I haven't seen the details of that case, but from what you've just said, clearly that's very serious, and I'm sure that the NHS will want to get to the bottom of that and carry out a very thorough investigation.
We might pick up on that later in the show, actually. That was George Eustice, Secretary of State for Environment, Food, Rural Affairs, Conservative MP for Camborne and Redruth, speaking to me from that COP26 summit up in Glasgow. Come to your thoughts in a few moments on what you make of the idea that, as Mr Eustice suggested, was not being ruled out, of having private landlords having to hit EPC ratings of C in order to rent out their properties, and indeed the possibility, not saying that it's coming down the line, but certainly not ruled out, of meaning that you wouldn't be able to sell your home if it didn't reach certain environmental standards. 0345 6060 973. Is that the kind of change we need to get to net zero by 2050? It's 10:19.
LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We'll hear from Labour in a few moments' time. Thangham Debonair, the shadow leader of the House of Commons, the Labour MP for Bristol West, will join us on what we've seen this week when it comes to the rather shambolic handling of everything that went on around Owen Paterson, who has now, of course, resigned as an MP. You heard what George Eustice had to say about it a little earlier. We'll speak to Labour in a few moments. I'm very keen to talk about COP, given it's half-time there. And in a few moments, we'll speak to Teddy Mugabe, who's the CEO of the Rwanda Green Fund, the largest green fund in Africa, about, from their point of view, what needs to be done to get us to net zero, to get us to the point where the 1.5 is kept alive. That's 1.5 degrees rising above pre-industrial averages. That is kept alive. And some of the changes that are going to be made here in order to do that may well include things like asking landlords to get, or telling landlords that they cannot rent their properties out unless they reach a certain environmental standard, unless their EPC rating is C. George Eustice saying that those ideas are not being ruled out, that it's not being ruled out, the suggestion that you might not be able to sell your home if you don't reach a certain environmental standard. I wonder what you make of that, because to my mind, of course I want to get to net zero by 20. I think that's the right thing to do. Of course we need to make these changes. That's absolutely fine. I do have a niggling problem with the rules changing around environmental policies that would see people not being able to sell their own homes unless they were to meet the costs themselves, costs that they had no fault in generating. It's not their fault that the house wasn't that was built in the 1800s or whatever it might be. I have a bit of a problem about government overreach in that area, to be honest with you. Martin's in Barnsley to kick us off. Martin.
Morning, Tom. It's yet again, politicians can't see further than us. So if you're the landlord and you can't get your property up to the standard of C, your tenant's got to leave. That puts pressure on local authority straight away, and you can just sit there, pay your rates and rent on the home. It'll cost you money to do that, but then the bill will fall on the local authority, won't it, to house them?
Well, quite possibly, but the person whose flat it is isn't generating any income, are they not? If they've not got anyone in it. But then again,
he can't sell it, can he? Because nobody else to be able to buy it with the mortgage. They don't think anything through.
So the upshot then is that the owner of the flat needs to pay whatever it's going to cost. A couple of £1,000, might be as much as 15 grand to get it to a higher environmental standard. That's good for everybody, no?
It is, but what about interest-free loans? For landlords.
What about them?
Well,
I see what you mean.
To give an incentive. It's the same with the electric cars. Next time you've got the electric car people on, I want you to try and get somebody on from the DNOs, the people who distribute the electric, i.e. Northern Power Grid, Scottish and Southern, and I guarantee you they won't come on because they're absolutely petrified of the cost. Because
do you think, Martin? Are you renting now, or are you a landlord yourself?
Why can't if they give me 6% interest rates, which what they should be in theory now with inflation, then a lot of people would leave the property market. But there's that many reluctant landlords because the government shoves them down that route, and it also exposes the imbalances in the economy. People want.
But even though, Martin, you know, the violins are not going to be broken out for the landlords here, I don't think, because people want to see these changes made to make the environment, the planet more habitable.
The property I've got, it doesn't affect me because mine's a C anyway. I spent the money up front. I've invested in it. But what people do not realise, the property I live in, I can't have an electric car, even though I've got a drive to park 2 cars on, because the DNO will not give me more than 63 amps. So if you've got 2 electric cars and a heat pump on, that's 52 amps. You turn your kettle on and your toaster on, your main fuse in your house is going to go. Right. And if you have a look on your area where you live in the southeast, for the fuse upgrade, it's £1,000.
I've got to be honest, Martin, my foray into electric vehicles has gone only as far as looking at the prices for PCP rates. So I haven't even got into any of that stuff yet. Listen, thank you very much indeed for the call. More calls in just a moment. Teddy Mugabe joins us, CEO of the Rwanda Green Fund, the largest green fund in Africa. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. I wonder if you, as you hear the conversation in the UK about the discussion around what's needed to get to 2050, net zero by 2050, whether you think it's all a bit first world problems.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I do believe that, first of all, this is going to require collective action. And so this does not just mean that it's the developed or the developing world. I think we all have a role to play. And just maybe to just give you, a perspective from Rwanda, where I'm from. I think one of, the first steps the government of Rwanda, positioned and mainstreamed climate change and environmental protection across sector policies. So it's very important that we have policies and strategies that clearly articulate how we're actually going to achieve, the different ambitious targets and the net zero by 2050. I think it's also important to have an implementation framework, because it's one thing to have strategies, but if there are no clear implementation frameworks, then it's it's going to be hard for us to achieve this. So, and that's how the Rwanda Green Fund was actually created. So, after having strategies, the government of Rwanda realized that we needed to have a financing vehicle which would really be a sort of like a channel in which we can attract climate finance to then be able to support projects across sectors that are in line with us. And then, last but not least, I think, at least from the expectations from COP, we're hoping to achieve, positive results, right, for the world and obviously for the developed and developing countries. But from the fund's perspective, we're also, hoping to see new commitments on climate finance for the developing world. So I think one of the questions that's being discussed right now is also how do we ensure that there's, an equal share between finance and I
saw. Sorry to interrupt, Teddy, but I saw that from the Paris climate change agreements, the money still hasn't yet really been implemented. The $100 billion has still not come about quite yet, and that's one of the things that's still being discussed at Glasgow. Would Rwanda view China, for example, as well as the West, as a partner in tackling climate change?
No, I totally, like I started, I think this requires collective action because we all live, it's one planet, it's one climate. So everyone has a role to play. And I think that's why we, when we talk about the 100 billion, it's true that that this hasn't been met. But we do. I am hopeful that from this COP, some of these pending commitments are going to be unlocked, and I think it's also a matter of us being innovative, and that's why for the longest time we've been talking about carbon credits. So I'm also hoping that Article 6 can be clearly articulated, because that's one way of ensuring that the developed
and Rwanda, for example, Teddy, is just for listeners who are critical perhaps of some of the measures that might come in that's going to cost them more, that's going to add to their to the burden of their household costs. I wonder if what you would say to them about the change that is hoping to achieve for a country like Rwanda, which is on the front lines of climate change.
So for me, I view it differently. I think it's true that the upfront costs are always more, but we need to view this as long term. So, maybe it's a little different. I wouldn't want to take the example of housing, but for example, in Rwanda, what we're trying to do is really ensure that during our planning, we consider climate change. So, for example, if we're building a bridge, it's important to consider climate change and ensure that you have drainage systems, because if you don't do it at the start, it's going to cost you more later. So I think that's the attitude that we all need to have, and then there's also the government, of course, has to come in and maybe provide subsidies or incentives or think of financial. I think we need to be innovative on how to ensure that we implement such, whether it's guaranteed, working with financial institutions to provide, loans that are concessional. So that's where that's how I think we need to think about it.
And we've seen talk of things like green mortgages, for example. Good to speak to you. Thank you for your time. Teddy Mugabo, you're the CEO of the Rwanda Green Fund, the largest green fund in Africa. 0345 6060 973 is the number. We'll speak to Craig McKinley, a Conservative MP for South Thanet. He leads the Net Zero Scrutiny Group in just a few moments about the success or otherwise of that COP26 climate summit. And by the way, if you were one of the many, many thousands of people who ended up on the streets yesterday protesting, I wonder if you see this climate summit as a complete disaster, a total failure, much against some of the arguments that are coming out from those who have obviously a vested interest in presenting it as having gone well. I wonder if you would come on and argue that it's been a complete failure because it's just not done enough, and that's why you are out protesting. 0345 6060 973. 10:32. News headlines now. Philip Chrysakos.
Environment Secretary George Eustice has told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC the government made a mistake trying to bring about changes, as it did, in the handling of the Owen Paterson lobbying row. Last week, Conservative MPs tried to overhaul the disciplinary process instead of suspending the now former minister before backtracking on their vote. Police in the United States are focusing on claims a security guard was injected in the neck with drugs as part of their investigation into the deaths of 8 people at a music festival in Texas. A 14 and 16-year-old were among them after an apparent crush in the crowd. A British man is due in court after being charged with making threats to kill an MP, understood to be a female Labour politician. The 41-year-old from England was arrested in Ireland yesterday. The weather: windy with severe gales across northern and eastern Scotland, showers easing in the far north, sunny spells elsewhere, a high of 12 degrees Celsius.
LBC. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Let's speak to Curtis in Coventry before we speak to Mr. McKinley. Hi, Curtis.
Hello. Hiya.
Your view on this idea about flats and landlords?
Yeah, as regards to trying to make a condition of rental that the property has to be a C, would take out hundreds of thousands of property out of the rental market, and quite possibly at the bottom end of the market where the most vulnerable people are. So it wouldn't work. At the moment, F and G, you're not allowed to rent out a property for anything from F, G onwards. So if they reduced it to an E, it might be possible. But to go from down to a C, because I know for a fact that with all the renovations I've done of properties which I rent out and then I've gone on to sell, to try and get them to a C is near impossible on certain types of property.
Why? Why is it impossible?
Well, because this to do a C on, say, a solid wall, 100-year-old house with electric heating, you're looking at 20, 30k, and that's the Midlands prices. So obviously in London it'd be a lot more than that. So the house would have to be empty for a start. It'd have to be a full renovation to get to a C. And then the landlord's just going to sell. I mean, they're not going to rent to the bottom end of the market for a property that's just spent 30 grand on. It just wouldn't work. It would take out possibly millions of properties around the country, because there's a lot of properties which just wouldn't get down to a C.
I think there's going to be a bit of a problem here when Boris Johnson talks about the guiding hand, the invisible hand of the market driving the change, driving prices down, driving that kind of. I can. That hand is going to be fighting with the invisible, or perhaps even more visible, hand of the state in saying to people, you can't rent your properties out if anything falls below C standard, or indeed, again, it's not an idea that has perhaps come forward yet, but George Eustice absolutely not ruling it out, the suggestion that you wouldn't be able to sell your home if it didn't meet certain environmental standards.
Well, that would be even worse, to be able to say you can't sell your home, because then the thing is, who's to say the next person who buys that? Because often when renovations of a major type take place, it's when the house is sold to the next owner, because the first owner, for whatever reason, can't do it and wants to move on, or it might be a deceased estate or whatever. I don't. But the next owner might spend that money on it. So to say that it can't be sold unless it's of a certain EPC rating, it just wouldn't work, would it? It just doesn't make sense. But I don't think they'll bring that in. But what they might do is bring down the EPC rating for a rental, which is fine. It's been quite a long time now where they've said anything above an F, you can't rent from F onwards. But that's fine. But to go down from F to C is going to be it just wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. It'd only work for very expensive properties where landlords are high net worth, where they're likely to rent the property out for a lot of money anyway.
Well, this is what I mean, Curtis. Thank you for the call. This is what I mean about the balance between absolutely getting behind the calls to get to net zero by 2050, about which the public is very supportive, according to the polls, versus the reality of having to pay for it, about which the public seems to be, according to the polls, rather less supportive. Craig McKinley joins us, Conservative MP for South Thanet, leader of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. I wonder, first of all, what you make of those reports in the papers, not expressly denied by the Secretary of State this morning, about the changes to landlords, of meaning that they would not be able to rent their property out if it falls below a C standard on EPC.
Well, your previous guy who was on, Curtis, I think he laid it out very, very well. We have a lot of older building stock in this country, solid brick, old-fashioned, a lot of listed properties. I mean, there are a couple of issues here that are almost you can't get over. Number one, if you were trying to do some significant alterations to get an older property, particularly in a conservation area or listed property, up to a C standard, you would have the current guidance and council saying, well, you can't do that. You just physically are not allowed to do that. But yes, are we going to take out millions of potential rental properties, potential houses that are just bought and sold freely on the market, off the market, just to reach some of these ideals? I mean, I'll make a declaration of interest here. I've got an old property that I rent out, and it manages a good D, because I've done everything I can. I've put lots of roof insulation in, but to get it to a C is just impossible. Can't be done. So if that's a future, it's not a very sensible one. What would be a sensible future, Tom? And this is what, I've got my concerns about this whole dash to net zero, as is well understood. We have been building 250 to 300,000 new homes a year since 2005, when a lot of this came to the fore. We had the Climate Change Act of 2008, which committed to an 80% reduction from 1990 levels. We are still not building today, and there will be quite a number of finished properties today that are not net zero. They are still having gas boilers put into them and all the rest of it. This is incoherent policies, because the best time to make a property net zero is when it comes out the ground and is built, and yet we're not doing it. I'm afraid this all adds up to the rather greenwash that we're hearing of lots of policies over this last few months, and particularly over this COP period.
Are we not doing that because the truth is that the technology is not quite there to be able to do it, or the cost of putting in that technology is too expensive for the builders to do it? Why isn't that happening, given that there are people, listeners to the programme, who ring in and say, I've got a heat pump, it works perfectly well?
No, you're absolutely right. I don't think the technology is advanced enough for people to make the leap. And of course, cost is a big factor. Will that go down as more and more people get into this technology? I made the similarity in a Public Accounts Committee hearing just a couple of weeks ago. Has the cost of air conditioning units, which these things fundamentally are similar to, have they come down completely and dramatically over the last 20 years? The answer to that is no. But from what I hear from people who have had them put in, and even people who install them, there is a big intake of breath, and they say, I'm sorry, these things do not work terribly well. They work well in the shoulder periods of the autumn and the spring, but in the depths of winter, you're pretty much reliant on good old electricity, and you will end up with a higher bill. As simple as that. This is about higher bills.
Yes, I wonder, Craig, though, what you would say to plenty of people who think it is a very, very good idea, necessary, urgent, that we do this work, that we get to net zero by 2050, if not earlier. And they hear someone like yourself, a backbench Conservative MP, and they view your scepticism and cynicism as a sort of prehistoric dinosaur concern. You are actually more concerned about stopping or halting the change on the climate, because really you're not totally signed up to the science.
I can tell you very clearly, Tom, there is nobody who wants to leave this planet in a better state than we found it than I do. There are things that we could be doing that are very sensible at COP. There's one very good thing that came out, and I fully agree with, that was reforestation, to try and repair some of the damage that we've been doing to our planet for a long time. There's been very little else about single-use plastics, about actually stopping proper noxious chemicals going into our soils, our seas and rivers and the air. Very little about that. The practical things that we could do.
So much more that could be done without seeing bills go up for your constituents.
Well, I mean, this is true of everything. We all like to be on the side of virtue until we have to pay for it. I've got 5 sort of tenets that I'm applying to every approach that I hear. Does it supply energy security? We've seen the problem with wind over the last couple of months, with the failure of 17 of the challenger new electricity companies. Affordability. Is this affordable? What will happen to the lower paid when they haven't been asked to pay for this? You and I, Tom, we would balk at another £1,000 a year energy cost, but we might be able to pay for it. For many, this will be a real issue of heat or eat. Practicality. Are these measures practical? Do they make life easier? Or is there a burden to freedoms and everything else, which I didn't become a Conservative to make people both colder and poorer? What does it do to those most vulnerable, not only in Britain, but it seems to me that the COP26 jamboree of the wealthy, the famous, and all the rest of it, telling the global poor how they might live. But most importantly, is there a better way? Now, there is a better way, and it's not some fringe technologies that don't really work just yet. It is a proper appraisal of nuclear, where we're way behind. We should have been doing this 15 years ago. Yeah. And we shouldn't be so anti-gas. We really shouldn't be so anti-gas. It's infinitely better than coal. And just think of the geopolitics of Western Europe spending billions of euros and pounds and any other residual currencies, paying that to Putin's Russia so he can rearm himself in an offensive way against us, is complete and utter lunacy.
Well, let me move from the geopolitics to the politics rather closer to home and ask you about what happened this week. Now, as I understand it, Craig, you voted for the amendment to postpone Owen Paterson's the decision made by the Standards Commissioner, only for that to have been removed less than 24 hours later. I wonder how you feel as a result of that and how you think Downing Street have handled this.
Well, there's two issues there. The reason I voted for it was because I think in any form of natural justice that applies in the workplace, in the proper court of law, and similarly what should happen in Parliament, is that there should be an appeal process. I felt that the process that we've been living under, which was put together in haste, let's not forget they're put together in haste after 2009 and the expenses scandal, has shown itself to have flaws.
But there is an appeals process. There is an appeals process. As reported by the Mail, MPs are already able to appeal against Standards Commissioner's findings as part of the Commons standards regime. And as the Mail says, Boris Johnson himself should know this because in July, the Standards Committee overruled the Standard Commissioner's findings that he had broken rules regarding his holiday in Mystique.
Yes, you have the Standards Committee, of course you do. But it's very rare for them to overturn anything. They do have a power, actually, within standing orders that is never used, and that is for a proper appeal, judicial-led, but it hasn't been used in any case that I know of, but it's a power that's available to them, where you can have a proper, fresh set of eyes looking at the whole procedure. But all that aside, we needed a new procedure. There's no doubt at all. It is sort of slightly unfortunate that it sort of matched in with the Owen Paterson case, but it did show in Owen's case that there was something that needed looking at. So we've linked the two together. Yes, obviously the vote was linked together, but the reality was we were trying to look at a new system, which I think is long overdue. It's funny.
So you don't have an issue with the Chief Whip? You don't have an issue with the Chief Whip or the leader of the House? You don't think their positions are now very difficult?
I don't see anything's changed at all. I will give you the benefit of every doubt and say that it's a pretty unedifying experience to be marched up to the top of the hill on one day just for them to come down the day after. Not a great look and not the best way of parliamentary time that we saw this week. But we are where we are. We need a new system. I'm very, very saddened for Owen. Very saddened. He's a decent man. I've known him a long time. Obviously, he's been on the Brexit side of things as I have, so I've spent a lot of time with him. He's had that enormous personal tragedy, and he's now thrown out. And I think that is a personal just disaster and tragedy to him. So I feel for him, but I think people are being forgotten in this process. It all becomes really political. Our evil Tories, nasty sleaze, and all the rest of it. And we don't seem to look about across the whole House. Let's look at the Labour Party on that same day. It had one of their members went through a criminal case, but we seem to forget all that.
The Labour Party are coming on the programme. They will have questions put to them about that as well. Thank you for your time. Craig McKinley, you're the Conservative MP for South Thanet, who leads that Net Zero Scrutiny Group. We will, as I said, speak to Thangam Debonair, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Labour MP for Bristol West. They're calling for Jacob Rees-Mogg to resign. I think she's even called for the Prime Minister to consider his position over what's happened this week. We'll speak to Thangam Debonair in just a moment. 10:49.
LBC.
I'm Camilla Tominey, here on LBC. Yet again, we're being warned that we have years, months to save the planet. How much more can the UK do? We've been urged to take micro steps. Let's take a bike or a bus instead of a car. What difference are you going to make when you've got global superpowers literally pumping out CO2 emissions as we speak? Join me, Camilla Tominey, today from 4. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC.
Plasma.
This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
Thangam Debonair is the shadow leader of the House of Commons and Labour MP for Bristol West, joins me live on the programme this morning. Thank you for being there, Thangam. Your thoughts on what we've seen this week and your calls, I see, for the Prime Minister to consider his position. On what grounds?
I mean, I want to be clear here. I think what he should consider is that he's acted as though he's above the law. He's also helped tried to protect a Tory MP who had been found wanting in a very proper process. I think this is a Prime Minister that's got form, and I think every Prime Minister of any party should be considering their position when they've been found to do things like this. That's up to him. I also think that it's really problematic. There seems like a pattern of behaviour going back throughout his entire Prime Ministership. Let's not forget, he started out by illegally proroguing Parliament, and it's just gone on and on and on. It's a real pattern of behaviour from this Prime Minister. I think also what we've seen this week is
sorry to interrupt, but you are the Labour Party is calling on Boris Johnson to consider his position as a result of everything that's gone on this week, but also before. And what does that mean in reality?
I'd like all of this government to be out of government and us to be in their place. Of course, no Labour politician would want anything else. But I really think that the whole government needs to review and have a good, cold, hard look at what they've done and said this week, because it's embarrassing for them. It's embarrassing for politics. But most of all, I think it's embarrassing for the Tory party to have put themselves in this position, and they need to clear up the mess they've started. I think there's plenty of things they could do to clear up the mess they've started. And that starts with a long, cold, hard look at themselves. And that's what I'm calling for, is the Prime Minister, Leader of the House, Chief Whip, sort out the mess they've made. They can do that. They could do that today. And there are plenty of things they could do to sort out this mess right now.
Do you think Jacob Rees-Mogg should resign?
I think Jacob Rees-Mogg, as I said, should clear up the mess that he's been part of. I personally think his position is untenable if he doesn't, but that's up to him. He needs to look at the fact that he announced business which should have been about a house matter, not wit, and then from the dispatch box, disgracefully, spoke in favour of a backbench amendment that drove a coach and horses through our independent standards process. And then 180-degree turn 24 hours later with absolutely no shame, saying it's unfortunate the two things were conflated. He was the one doing the conflating, and I said so at the time. He conflated it. He sets the timetable. He really needs to clean up this mess, and that's up to him. That's what calling on him to review his position means for me, is there are things he can do to fix this even now. He could sort it out, and I don't see any signs that he's doing so.
So what Labour want to see the government do as a result of this is to sort it out. What does sort it out look like?
So, first of all, rule out Owen Paterson getting a peerage. That shouldn't even have been considered, and it should be denied really quickly, firmly, forthwith. Second of all, make sure that we get the motion rescinded that was passed so shamefully last week, putting so much, just driving that coach and horses, as I said, but also putting the process of MPs actually trying to represent their constituents under enormous pressure, as we've heard with stories of Tory MPs being told, you need to think about whether or not you're going to get your levelling up money if you don't vote for this. That's the second thing they need to do. The third thing they need to do is go back to the Standards Committee motion, which is what we were supposed to be doing last Wednesday. I would personally want them to vote for that, but that's obviously, it's not a whippable matter. I think they should put that back. And then we can review the entire process, clean and separate from the Owen Paterson case, which is the right thing to do. Now, the Standards Committee already is reviewing the Code of Conduct quite properly. They do that all the time. The Commissioner for Standards in Public Life published his report last week reviewing the process, called for it to be strengthened. I think it should always be strengthened. There are other options open to us. First, clean up the mess. Then we can sort out how we might want to change the system, which we should always do. We should only ever strengthen the process.
And yet, this, Conservative government, you would say, mired in sleaze with people who should fall on their sword because of the way in which they've brought into disrepute Parliament and also standards in public life, remain ahead of the Labour Party in the polls. How do you explain that?
Well, I think that we have started to turn a corner. People have started looking at Keir as a Prime Minister. I certainly see him as a great Prime Minister.
He hasn't been here this week.
I think they're drawing a contrast between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. I've heard that Boris Johnson's poll ratings this morning are not looking too clever at all, because people have seen sleaze for what it is. Have we got more work to do? Of course. And that's what we'll keep on doing every single day. But the Labour Party is a government in waiting. And when the public feels that this is a government that's too sleazy, the Tory government's too sleazy to put up with, we're ready and waiting. We've got policies. It's not just about waiting for the Tory government to fall on any sorts of swords, which were your words, not mine. This is also about putting forward an alternative. I think what we've got in Keir Starmer, in contrast to the lawbreaker over here, which is Boris Johnson and his illegal prorogation, we've got the law enforcer over here, which is Keir Starmer with his long history of being in charge of as Director of Public Prosecutions. Really clear contrast. Plus, when we find out that one of our MPs has done something wrong, we deal with it. What do the Tories do? They try and cover it up or try and get him off the hook.
You're referencing Claudia Webb specifically there?
I am indeed, because Claudia Webb, we suspended her as soon as she was charged, we expelled her as soon as she was convicted, and we are now calling on her to resign. And if she won't resign, which is the right thing to do, we will be supporting a recall petition so that her constituents can make their own choice.
She wants to appeal. She says she didn't do it.
That's up to her, but I want her to resign. I think she really needs to know that she's brought disgrace on the Labour Party, frankly, and she's been found, she's been convicted. It's up to her to decide if she wants to appeal. I'd like her to resign.
Heck of a grim week for MPs and Parliament, I'm afraid, with those two things going on. Let me just ask you this finally. In one of the papers this morning, MPs could be banned from taking on second jobs as political consultants in the wake of the Owen Paterson case. I wonder whether you think that's now ripe for review, that MPs should not be having second jobs of any kind whilst representing people that voted for them.
Political consultants and directorships and those sorts of things, they are an absolute disgrace. Clearly the system's in a mess. In fact, the previous leader but two, Ed Miliband, put forward a motion on that exact thing, which the Tories voted against in 2015. I mean, we just don't see any way in which you can justify this sort of conflict of interest. Would anybody criticise Rosanna Allen Khan, a qualified doctor, from helping out at her local hospital, or someone who's in the Army Reservists from serving when they are called to serve? I don't think so. But I think
so. Those Labour MPs who may have second jobs or paid employment elsewhere, non-exec direct, they should give those up.
I don't see where the evidence for that is. I think what we've actually got is a clear difference here between Tory ex-ministers who are taking jobs as consultants and, people like, say, Rosanna, who are serving when called. I mean, by the way, I think there are MPs on all sides who've got skills that the public would want them to keep up and keep contributing when their country needs them.
OK. Thangan Debonair, great to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. You're the Shadow Leader of the House of Commons Labour MP for Bristol West. Thank you very much indeed for your time. After the news at 11, I want to come back to what we were discussing there with Thangan Debonair, this issue that we've seen in the House of Commons this week. Very, very unedifying that the government U-turned within 24 hours after that vote was held. I wonder whether you think that wouldn't be a bad suggestion to stop MPs from having any second jobs. They should be working hard enough to represent you in the job that they have at the moment. If that's the case, do you think there's an argument to suggest paying MPs more in order to absolutely persuade them that it's in their financial interests not to bother having second job? And I wonder what you make of Sir John Major's criticism of the current Prime Minister, criticising the government's handling of it, says it's unconservative, that it is politically corrupt. Is that your view of the government?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 11 o'clock. A cabinet minister is dismissing the Owen Paterson lobbying row as a Westminster storm in a teacup, admitting there's a frustration the scandal has shifted focus from the COP26 climate change summit in Glasgow. Last week, Conservative MPs tried to overhaul the parliamentary disciplinary process instead of suspending the now former MP for breaking rules before backtracking on their vote. Environment Secretary George Eustace has told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC a mistake was made in the government's handling of the row.
We've been very clear that with hindsight, yes, it was an error to bring that forward in the way that we did because there was a danger that it would get conflated with the Owen Paterson case. But it was right to try to establish an appeals process. We still think that's the right thing to do. There's a debate on Monday, and we'd hope to have cross-party talks on how to introduce such an appeal in future.
Well, Labour is leading calls for former Conservative Minister Owen Paterson to be refused a peerage to the House of Lords. Party leader Sir Keir Starmer has written to the panel that considers nominations to reject any attempt following the lobbying row. Conservative MPs voting not to suspend him for breaking parliamentary rules and instead trying to overhaul the disciplinary system. Tammy Banks is a non-political member of the Standards Committee. She says it was disappointing.
The hard work and the commitment that every panel member put into not only this complaint, but all of the complaints that we go through. I felt like that had really been undermined. And so I was disappointed and upset.
In other headlines this hour, police in the United States say they're considering possible manslaughter after 8 people died at a music festival. Detectives are investigating claims a security guard was injected with drugs at the event in Texas. Houston Police Chief Troy Finner has released this statement.
Kids and young individuals that was out there, if you see something, say something. This is now a criminal investigation that's going to involve our homicide division as well as narcotics. And we're going to get down to the bottom of it.
A British man is due in court after being charged with making threats to kill an MP. The 41-year-old from England was arrested in Ireland yesterday. The Irish Times reports the person targeted by the alleged threat is a female Labour politician. Insulate Britain says it's considering new tactics to block roads across the United Kingdom. The climate protesters say they didn't think, in their words, they'd get away with more than 2 or 3 weeks of demonstrations. Founding member of UB40 Astro, real name Terence Wilson, has died after a short illness at the age of 64. The musician formed the band in 1978 in Birmingham, with the name a reference to a form issued to people claiming unemployment benefit at the time. UB40 say they are absolutely devastated and completely heartbroken. The weather: windy with severe gales across northern and eastern Scotland, showers easing in the far north, sunny spells elsewhere, a high of 12 degrees Celsius. From Global's newsroom, I'm Philip Chrysikos.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC.
Very good morning to you. 6 minutes past 11 is the time. You're listening to Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC. I'm Tom Swarbrick. Hope we find you very well this Sunday morning. We'll speak later on this hour to Professor Damian Johnson, who is President of the Academy of Medical Sciences and is a member of SAGE. Do you remember SAGE? Feels like, I don't know whether in my head it feels like a while ago that we'd heard from SAGE, but no, we'll speak to SAGE about the case rate in the UK. It is coming down. And it'd be interesting to see what SAGE thinks are the reasons for why that case rate is coming down from the heights that it was at around the beginning of half term. Now, it might be I've given the reason inadvertently as to why it is that cases may have come down, maybe because schools aren't going back. But we'll speak to SAGE a bit later about COVID in the UK at the moment as the policies kick in. And indeed, you've only got a few days left, if memory serves right, if you work in the care sector to get your jab. Otherwise, you're going to lose your job. It's going to be the situation brought in for NHS staff, we're led to believe, although perhaps not until April. So we'll speak to SAGE member Professor Damian Johnson a little bit later. After 12... I'll be honest with you, I'm denied about doing this because I just think it's the details are so horrific as to warrant really not being said out loud, to be honest with you. But I do want to look at this case of David Fuller, the man who admitted murdering 2 women in 1987 in Tunbridge Wells, and the crimes that were also found to have been committed by him in a hospital mortuary over a long period of time. Now, I won't say any more than that for now because I realise you might have kids listening and it's genuinely unbelievably upsetting. But we'll come on to what can be done, what should be done around that whole case after the news at 12 o'clock. For now, let's focus on what happened in Westminster this week with the issue around Owen Paterson, lobbying, sleaze, and more scandal unfolding on the front page of the Sunday Times, I note. They say new Tory sleaze row as donors who pay £3 million get seats in Lords. The investigation shows Conservative Treasurer is the most ennobled job, with the appointment of various people leaving a bad taste in the mouths of those who vet such appointments. Apparently they were overruled in the decision to appoint one person into the House of Lords. Now, to be honest, I think most people who give a politics a passing glance, view the House of Lords with so much disdain that it's probably not a surprise that people who have a lot of money and do certain jobs for political parties are then, surprisingly or not, offered a seat as part of the legislature. I think we've become flea-bitten enough about politics to think that it's not massively surprising that that's the case. This issue, though, of MPs having second jobs, again, calls in some of the papers suggesting that those days might be coming to an end. I wonder whether you think it is about time that MPs are told that they have to focus on you, the voter, their constituents, rather than take these other sometimes paid non-exec director jobs or lobbying jobs that has landed Owen Paterson on the wrong side of the Standards Commissioner, who said that there were multiple and egregious breaches of lobbying rules. A Standards Commissioner, by the way, whom Cabinet ministers were suggesting ought to consider her position. I want you to listen to this. This is the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng, who was speaking to Sky News on Thursday about Catherine Stone's position, who is the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, and what he felt she should now do.
I think it's difficult to see what the future of the Commissioner is, given the fact that we're reviewing the process and we're overturning and trying to reform this whole process. But it's up to the Commissioner to decide her position.
So you think she should resign?
All I've said is that we're trying to reform the process, and I think that's what I'm very focused on.
Now, Kwasi Kwarteng could be in a spot of bother about that, because Labour is suggesting that he may have broken the ministerial code by even suggesting that an independent authority lead should consider their position. I put some of that to the Environment Secretary, George Eustace, earlier on this morning. Take a listen.
Look, as I said, it's not really for any member of Parliament or Prime Minister or Minister to be happy or otherwise. She's there to do an independent role, and she reports obviously to a committee on parliamentary standards.
Well, one wonders then why a cabinet colleague of yours suggested that she might have to consider her position. Why are the Prime Minister's instincts
as I just said, I think what he was saying is that the role of the Commissioner, he wasn't saying she should consider her position. He was saying we would need to think about how the overall role of a Commissioner, whoever the occupant of that might be, would fit into a new system.
I'll leave you to judge. Martin Bell is a former independent MP for Tatton who defeated Neil Hamilton as an independent candidate, is a prominent anti-sleaze campaigner and author of A Very British Revolution, The Expenses Scandal and How to Save Our Democracy. Thank you for joining the programme, Martin. Good to see you. Do you think we are back in the bad old days of sleaze again?
Yes, I do think we are. For a couple of reasons. This should have gone away after the Nolan Commission, after the scandals of the 1990s. It shouldn't be with us still. And yet what we've seen the last week, I sat on this committee for standards for 3 years. It was a tough job and it was interesting. It gave me an insight. But one of the things I noticed that all our recommendations back in the late 1990s, all the penalties we proposed were upheld by the House of Commons in one of its full sessions. There was never an attempt by a government to reverse a decision or to block it. So to that extent, I think what we've seen these past few days is almost, if anything, worse than in the 1990s.
Worse because the government have sought to overturn that ruling of an independent body?
Yes, the Commissioner is independent and the Standards Committee is cross-party. It's not a perfect system. It's the one agreed by all parties. But overnight, we've come to a decision to block that ruling and to recast the whole disciplinary process, not in concert with the other parties, but unilaterally, was a huge mistake. And I think it's cut through to the public in a way that some of the other setbacks of this government are not.
I note your name comes up in the Sunday Times today, Martin. I don't know if this is a surprise to you at all, but apparently you have been spoken to by the Liberal Democrats who have offered you a chance to be their candidate to fill the seat that is going to be left vacant by Owen Paterson. Would you be able to rule in or rule out you standing as the Liberal Democrats candidate?
I did have a conversation. I don't remember it was about that. I was advising them that I felt that because Mr. Paterson had resigned his seat, the case for a cross-party, independent, anti-sleaze candidate was not as strong. I was asked by once the Liberal Democrats to stand for them in the North Norwich by-election about 2009, but I declined because I'm not a party member.
So that's not true then. That the Liberal Democrats did not offer you the chance to be their candidate for that seat.
Not the best of my memory. Also, I'm 83. I'm on a stick. I'm not sure I'd vote for myself. I'm so old.
Oh, come on. I think if Joe Biden can do it, Martin, there's hope for everybody. So how is this resolved ultimately? Does this not show the intention of the government is to believe that it can do anything it likes, regardless of the independence of whoever it says is doing wrong?
I think it's resolved as it should be in a democracy by the people. If you have an MP who you think is not living up to the standards you wish him or her to, then the answer is at the ballot box. If the people of North Shropshire want to go on having a Conservative MP, it's up for them. I would suggest one constituency it's worth you looking at professionally is Leicester East. I don't know what it is about the air of Leicester East, but if Keith Vaz were to seek to return to the House of Commons, as well he might, I think there might well be a case for putting up an independent candidate agreed by the other parties.
Would you fancy a turn at Leicester East?
Do you know, way back in 2001, I was in contact with some very unhappy constituents of Keith Vaz. And I went up in disguise. I wore a dark suit. I advised them. It would be tempting, but I'm too old. Sorry.
Let me and just finally ask you about the second jobs thing. Have MPs having second jobs had their time?
I don't think so. I think what's had its time is MPs lobbying and being paid for it. Suppose you're a dentist, maybe, and you win election in a marginal constituency, then you really need to keep up with the dentistry in case you're defeated at the next election. I think that's the case for a moderate degree of MPs keeping their hand in at other professions. But Tom, if you ever want to be a member of Parliament, you're well placed because you can do the sound bites, can't you?
Do you know, Martin, I couldn't think of anything worse. But thank you very much indeed for the offer. Martin Bell, former independent MP for Tatton, defeated Neil Hamilton as an independent candidate, anti-sleaze campaigner. His book, A Very British Revolution, The Expenses Scandal and How to Save Our Democracy. I wonder whether you think the events of the past week show that democracy needs saving. If so, how? 0345 6060 973. We'll speak to Sir Alistair Graham, former chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, in just a moment. It's 11:16.
LBC Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Here's Mitch in North London's take on the front page of the Sunday Times this morning. Tom, that headline might just as well have been "Bears Poo in the Woods." It's not exactly breaking news that the people who donate large amounts of money to political parties get seats in the House of Lords. Every mainstream party is at it. When in living memory has it ever been any different, says Mitch, cynically. 0345 6060 973, the number. We'll get the impact on the polls of this story over the past few weeks in just a moment. First, Sir Alistair Graham is the former chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Thank you very much for coming on the programme, Sir Alistair. Your view of what the government attempted to do this week by overruling, in effect overruling, the findings of that independent body?
Well, it was, as it turned out, a disastrous move by the government. And I think there's some evidence to suggest that they were really not about safeguarding Owen Paterson, but the Prime Minister was seeking to safeguard his own position by getting rid of the Commissioner for Standards in the House of Commons.
What gives you that impression?
Well, we had a minister come on suggesting that she should consider her position, given the vote that had taken place, which really sought to abolish the standards arrangements that existed in the House of Commons. The fact that he thought she should consider her position in the light of that decision suggests to me that this was one of the real reasons why this whole farrago took place.
The government this morning, when I put that to the Secretary of State, suggested that his colleague wasn't calling on her to resign, but merely to look again at what that role should actually be like as and when changes are made to introduce the possibility of appeals.
Well,
Did
I
that
think
wash with you, Sir Alistair?
That's weasel words for really suggesting she should consider whether it was appropriate to resign.
I would agree with you on that. Sir John Major has described the government as politically corrupt. Do you think it is?
Well, I think what was taking place over the past 72 hours was corrupt, was about undermining our whole system of standards that have been developed. It's not perfect. I can suggest ways of improvement. But I think that was a corrupt act, and it was led from Downing Street, and they have to accept responsibility for it.
What do you think it says about voters who, see this story, maybe see the edges of this story across the newspapers, and yet the polls would suggest that the Conservatives remain in the lead?
Yes, but I think there's been a significant drop in their poll numbers, but you've got somebody else who's going to talk about that, so you'll get an up-to-date
But do you think, Alistair, that based on what we've seen, are you surprised that people would still support Conservatives in government whom you believe are politically corrupt?
Well, I am surprised because I think it's such a serious act of devastation of our standards arrangements. And if you look alongside other measures, for example, they want to radically change the powers of the Electoral Commission. They want to change and limit who can vote in certain circumstances. If you add all these up together, they're a pretty massive attack on our democratic system.
Good to speak to you. Sir Alistair Graham, thank you very much indeed. You're the former chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Here's Joe in Cheshire. Tom, I'm sick to death of hearing about MPs needing more money. I am responsible for triple-figure £1,000,000 budgets of public money, and I take that responsibility extremely seriously. I'm not even on 40 grand a year. I don't have time for a second job. I earn above average wage. I'm skilled and good at my job. All I can see here, says Joe in Cheshire, is Tory greed. Let's come on to the polling. Gideon Skinner is the head of political research at Ipsos Mori. Thank you for coming on, Gideon. How is this story playing out in those polls?
So it's, to be honest, it's still a bit early to say. I think one of the important points was actually raised by your caller Mitch at the beginning, that long-standing cynicism is certainly something that is reflected in the polls. I mean, we've been asking trust in MPs going back to 1983, however many decades that is, and the highest it has ever been over that period is 23%, so 1 in 4 people. So over those decades, the highest proportion of people we've ever seen trusting MPs to tell the truth is only about a quarter.
And falling?
So I suppose what's interesting is that we have seen it fall. So we saw it fall in 2009 after the expenses scandal, for example, and that clearly had an impact on public trust in politicians and the political process. It did sort of slowly recovered. If anything, we actually saw a bit of an increase in trust during the COVID pandemic as part of a sort of rallying around effect. But clearly, this scandal could have another impact. The big question, of course, is whether it has an impact on the actual polls, because we know there's partisanship amongst the public as a whole. Boris Johnson is perhaps less trusted than Keir Starmer, but actually amongst Conservative supporters, Boris Johnson's ratings remain high. So the question is whether something like this actually changes many people's opinion of who they want to vote, given everything else they're going to be thinking about as well. Yeah,
and I wonder if people will start to see stories like this as was described earlier, as a pattern. This probably isn't your place to comment, Gideon, but I will. It strikes me that the Prime Minister his first intention is to try and protect people who have been found to have done wrong. I mean, whether it's Dominic Cummings and Barnard Castle, whether it's Matt Hancock and breaking the rules, or whether it's Owen Paterson and this. It seems like the Prime Minister's first instinct is to try and jettison the rules to protect the individual.
I suppose going back, what we can say from the polling is that isn't the only thing that people judge Prime Ministers on, though. We can go back to previous prime ministers who maybe were seen as their opposition. The opposition leaders had better ratings on things like honesty and so on. But previous prime ministers, such as Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, and so on, they were seen as more competent, better judge of crisis, able to get things done. And those things can be just as important as the trustworthy bit. I mean, the wider context is that the Conservatives. If we compare the Conservative lead now with where it was, say, in the early summer, it's clearly that lead has narrowed, and in some ways is pretty close to neck and neck in some polls. But there are a number of things going on that might explain that as well. We're seeing falling economic optimism. We're seeing concern about climate change, of course. We're seeing worries about the energy crisis and shortages. All of those things beginning to have an impact on the public mood as well.
Very good to speak to you. Thank you for coming on the programme. Gideon Skinner, you're the head of political research at Ipsos Mori. I do wonder whether the story of the last week, all this toing and froing about Owen Paterson and the rules, has moved anyone's needles. Has it prompted you to do something that you thought you might do before, but you're now not going to do based on this story or this pattern that we continue to see that I described a little earlier of the Prime Minister's instincts? Does that matter to you at all? Because I know that there are people who are exceptionally, and I think understandably, angry about what has happened here. But they were also people who weren't going to vote for Boris Johnson anyway. So has anyone changed their mind based on this? Another text here. Tom, I'm a lifelong Conservative voter. I can tell you that all these stories about sleaze will make no difference to the way I vote at the next election, for the simple reason that I am resigned to the fact that the political world is sleazy, politics even sleazier, and the only reason that Conservatives are sleaziest right now is because they are the party in government. Trust me, if we get a Labour government next, the lobbyists who are dangling carrots in front of Conservative MPs to get them to do their bidding with government ministers will be buzzing around Labour MPs like bees round a honeypot, and history suggests they will just as easily be corrupted. Dave's in Norwich. Dave?
Good morning, Tom. A lovely programme, by the way. Can I just start by saying, at the age of 17, along with probably hundreds of thousands of other people that are listening to you now, at the age of 17, I put my hand on the Bible and swore allegiance to my Queen and country when I joined the British Army. And I served in the British Army. But now I look at this political system, and I'm not being nasty, but it is corrupt. The whole thing is corrupt. Unfortunately, the British public voted for the Brexit vote, and UKIP won it. And what happens immediately as a result of that? Okay, we've got to get rid of them, and that's what they did. They put political plants into the party and destroy UKIP. So UKIP is pretty well gone. It's the Conservative Party. But now I listen to things that are coming out of Westminster, lies, and more lies. I'm not blaming you, but what hasn't been mentioned once this morning, which is the major concern of the British people, the fact that this country has been invaded by migrants from across the world. And what is Boris Johnson and the rest of his government doing about it? Absolutely nothing.
Well, Dave, to be honest with you, I mean, I have to say, Dave, I sigh deeply when you say these things, not least because it is covered an awful lot. I mean, it's in the newspapers all the time. It's we've covered it before. And you're right, there is a big problem of people coming on boats from the north of France into this country, and there's a difficulty with processing asylum applications and the UK acting as a draw for would-be asylum seekers, because the only place that really you can make an asylum claim is in the UK. But I don't propose to go into that now, and I think the term invaded is just so well worn, Dave, as to be sort of irritating and not particularly accurate. Thank you for the call. 0345 6060 973. Is this a way away from the issues that actually matter, whether it's Dave's invasion or others, that you think that this is just part of the political scene? You're not particularly surprised, you're not particularly interested. What does this say too about where Labour are? Do you think this is fertile ground for them to make a charge at the Tory lead from, if they plant their tanks firmly on the anti-sleaze, anti-corruption, prosecutor versus the person that breaks the law? Is that going to persuade you? Do you think that's worthy of the Labour Party pursuing in order to try and garner more votes and more support? 0345 6060 973. Your calls after this. Tom Swarbrick here, 11:31. News headlines. Philip Christakos.
Labour is calling on the Prime Minister to resign over his handling of the Owen Paterson lobbying row. The party's shadow leader of the House of Commons, Thanam Debonair, has told Swarbrick on Sunday on LBC Boris Johnson has, in her words, a pattern of behaviour and should go. Last week, Conservative MPs tried to overhaul the disciplinary process instead of suspending the now former minister before backtracking on their vote. Police in the United States are looking into claims a security guard was injected in the neck at a concert in Texas. 8 people, including a 14 and 16-year-old, died during a music festival. The Health Secretary has started a campaign to Save Christmas, urging people to get their COVID booster vaccine. Sajid Javid says they'll help stop restrictions being imposed in England over the festive period. The weather: windy with severe gales across northern and eastern Scotland, showers easing in the far north, sunny spells elsewhere, a high of 12 degrees Celsius.
LBC Swarbrick on Sunday with Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
I think Anthony makes a really fair point here on Twitter. Tom, to resort to the lazy line of "they're all the same" is a cowardly way of absolving yourself and those in power of responsibility either for corruption or failure to identify corruption. I think I do think that is a fair point. It's very easy to say, "Oh well, we all knew this, really," and therefore gloss over the reality of from the top came the instructions to try and put a stay of execution on someone who had been found by an independent body to have egregiously and repeatedly broken the standards that we agree should be acceptable and should be held to for all members of Parliament. Ian's in Swansea. Hi, Ian.
Oh, hi, Tom. I just don't agree with that Twitter chap. If I can just quickly say, in my history, I remember Robin Cook, who was an outstanding politician in his time and stood on principle. And on the other side of the chamber, Geoffrey Howe. So people do enter politics for the right reason. But for me, Tom, I do agree that both. Well, let's call it for what it was. The corrupt attempt to destabilise our democracy this week has been it left a pain in my stomach with anger when I was watching it, and those 250 MPs who voted for it. You had one on this morning blustering through a load of waffle. Should hang their heads in shame and ask themselves what they entered politics for. But on the other end of the scale, Tom, I'm also disappointed bitterly with the opposition. You had a major opposition MP on this morning, and she failed dismally to bring the public. If you come out here in the real world, most right-thinking people are outraged, angry, upset. You know, we faced a pandemic, we're facing all sorts of woes, and what do? They tried to undermine our democracy. And what do Labour do? Oh, we're not calling for heads. They should have a look at themselves. What I'm going to do, and I suggest to my fellow Brits, we look at who's on the candidate list, we check them out, and I don't care if they represent a raving loony party. If they prove that they've got the moral compass, the credentials, somebody like Caroline Lucas, to actually do their job, they're going to get my vote. I no longer attach myself to any label. They're not all corrupt. There's some very decent. I thought Bryant, is that his name? Excuse me if it's not.
Chris Bryant.
Chris Bryant, sorry, who stood up and gave a very measured response. You could see the seething anger. You know, they were calling.
Well, Ian, just on the point about the anger, you say, you know, most normal people are absolutely seething about this. That when you talk to your friends and your family about this, they can't believe it. I just wonder whether that's actually quite a niche view, only because most people don't pay great deal of attention to what's happening. Well, maybe more so than previously, but when you talked about Thangam Debonair, the Labour shadow leader of the House of Commons, on the programme earlier, and was talking about what it is that the government needs to do, and she said, well, the government needs to revoke the standing order, it then needs to go back and and I just couldn't help but think this is very, very inter-Westminster, this stuff. This is very, very niche and in the weeds, when the broader point is the one surely that you're making, which is we can't go on with being mired in sleaze in this way, and if no heads roll for it, what does that say?
And you know, I'm not only really, I think you're right in a sense. I think this is the pinprick that burst the abscess. And I'm not being party political, right down the line here. Take the vote on dumping raw sewage into our rivers. I remember when the privatisation of the water companies took place, and Margaret Thatcher said, and I agreed at the time, the governments are not looking after our rivers properly. Private enterprise work.
Yeah, will come and do the job. Yeah,
will come and do the job, and we need all the Victorian infrastructure to be ripped down. They make profits to do that. They'll have a decent profit, and they didn't do it. And
well, Ian, listen, I agree with you on that, but the thing about that sewage vote, the manner in which it was presented as MPs have voted to allow raw sewage to be spilt into rivers, and that, I'm afraid, is not what happened. There was a presentation of it that yes, could lend itself to that view, but the detail of what actually happened there, it wasn't as clear cut as these MPs voted to allow raw sewage to go into rivers. It was to do with storm drains and an amendment that was put out. It was very detailed and rather complicated. Ian, listen, thank you very much for the call. John's in Sherborne in Dorset. Hi, John.
Good morning.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Far away.
Yeah, my point was that if MPs are going to have two jobs, what about the rest of the economy? I mean, I was a nurse for 49 years, and I had colleagues who would work a night shift for an agency and then come into work and then lose the plot halfway through a shift, sometimes so tired they were sent home by the nurse in charge. And I know of firemen who are taxi drivers, police who moonlight as club bouncers and personal security. You've got an economy that depends on two jobs. Are you going to ask the MPs to set an example by only having one job? I don't think that's going to work. And if you want to look at the way they compare to the common man, how about all the restaurants in the House of Parliament tagging their prices to the rest of the area and do away with ministerial cars? They tell us what we should be doing, that they never lead by example. And the idea that any of them would comply with one job is beyond belief. They'd find another way around it. I mean, they talk about lobbying. Lord Levy, Lord Cashpoint, lobbying for Blair. He raised nearly £100 million. I mean, it's only lobbying of another form, except it's pimping rather than lobbying, you know?
Well, John, this is, if you don't mind me saying, extreme cynicism. I think, in effect, you're saying, nothing can be done, it's never going to change, 'twas always thus, 'twill always ever be thus. Aren't you?
Pardon?
Isn't that what you're suggesting, that it won't ever change?
I don't think it will. I became a Conservative 60 years ago when it was unfashionable to do so, coming from a Labour household. And I wonder now where we are. I mean, we seem to be in a morass. I mean, I looked at a recent YouGov poll, and it was in the Mail, but the poll suggested that 47% of the people thought that Boris Johnson was doing a better job than Keir Starmer on 27%. If that's the kind of view of the public, then we are lost. Are we not?
Well, see, I really hate the view that says the public are wrong, the public is an idiot, that all the people who don't agree with me are idiots. That's why they don't agree with me. I think that's a really... I don't like that view at all. I think that's a harsh view of it.
Well, OK, Tom, but we live in a society where it seems identity politics is the rule of the day. And if we're talking about surveys, they are opinions. And really, it makes one person's opinion no less valid than anybody else's if they do their research.
Sure. You're more than entitled to your opinion, John, but I just think it's lazy to say, well, they're all idiots. What's the best way of persuading them round to your view that this government is indeed corrupt, that the Conservative Party is corrupting, that actually nothing is done about it and it's allowed to go on because ultimately it comes from the top?
Well, I could respond, if I may, Tom, to a question of laziness. It's rather lazy to call this government corrupt when they're doing the same kind of things that governments have done before or since. And Lloyd George wasn't... I'm not saying it makes it right. You know, sort of labelling the government corrupt. There are a lot of MPs of all parties who go out there with good intentions to try and do a decent job. And then they're hobbled by the cynicism, if you like, of their leaders.
All right. OK, John, I appreciate the call. Thank you very much indeed. 0345 6060 973. If you support this Conservative Party if you like this Prime Minister. Are you an idiot? 0345 6060 973. We'll speak to Sage in just a few moments. 11:45.
LBC.
I'm Camilla Tominey, here on LBC. Yet again, we're being warned that we have years, months to save the planet. How much more can the UK do? We've been urged to take micro steps. Let's take a bike or a bus instead of a car. What difference are you going to make when you've got global superpowers literally pumping out CO2 emissions as we speak? Join me, Camilla Tominey, today from 4. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC.
This is LBC, Swarbrick on Sunday, with Tom Swarbrick, live from Westminster.
11:49 the time. Christine, I'll come to your call in just a moment. Front page of the Mail on Sunday. Ministers are drawing up plans to bring back tests and quarantine for those who refuse a third jab. The Mail says no booster, no hassle-free foreign travel. British travellers who fail to make their booster jabs face renewed restrictions. Plans to reimpose quarantine and testing for those who have refused their third vaccine are currently being drawn up by ministers to protect the UK against the spread of new coronavirus variants. But the paper says they are likely to prove controversial if introduced before most of those eligible for their booster have received it. So far, only 60% have done so. Let's speak to Professor Damon Johnson, President of the Academy of Medical Sciences and a SAGE member. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. First of all, I wonder what you make of the plan to introduce booster jabs for or restrictions for those who haven't had their booster jabs if they want to travel.
Well, I think the first thing to say about the booster jabs is booster jabs are going to help us regardless of travel, because they're going to help us reduce transmission in the population. And we've really got high rates of transmission at the moment in the UK. And booster jabs are going to help us control those and also prevent people from getting from getting more severe disease as immunity wanes. So I think that's a very important point.
Why? In what way do jabs help to prevent transmission? I realise they help break the link between illness and severe illness. But isn't the data on transmission, the potential breaking of transmission, that's falling away now, isn't it?
Yes, and that's why we have to have a booster campaign. So the evidence is that the main effect of the vaccines in protecting us from the disease is that because of the vaccine, because we've now got a high uptake of the vaccine, that we are seeing much fewer admissions and deaths relative to the number of cases than we saw at the peak of the epidemic last year. But we must remember we are still got about 1,000 deaths a week, which is quite a significant number, much less than we would have had. So the evidence is that the vaccines do not, as you know, stop you completely from getting infection, but they do reduce the risk of infection by about 50%. And that's the point so it's important people understand the vaccines only reduce your risk of getting infected. And we also know that people, once they are infected, can pass it on. But we do also know that after about 6 months, the amount of protection you're getting in terms of infection and outcomes is beginning to diminish, and that's why we need the booster program. So the vaccines are having several effects. The most important ones in terms of the NHS and individuals is, of course, that you don't get so sick. You're much protected from severe disease. But because that immunity wanes, and we need to understand more about that.
I understand that.
And that's why it's important to have them. Yeah.
And there's a distinction, an important one, between someone having their third booster jab and someone having their third primary jab, i.e. those people who are immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, who, because of a lack of antibodies presented by the first two jabs, are being asked to go again. Do you think that those people should be concerned about the lack of effect that the vaccines seem to be having?
Well, I think all of us, I think that, the vaccines are undoubtedly protecting us. And obviously people who have immunosuppression, some people just don't get such a good response to the vaccine. That's why those who are immunosuppressed get a third vaccine. But, vaccines are not the only answer. They're very important, but they're not the perfect answer. And that's why maintaining some of the practices, the behavioural practices, become so important in stemming this epidemic. Nothing's perfect. It's the sum of all these things that have imperfect effects, which are going to get the virus rate down. We really have been going along at a very high rate of infection over the last months and summer, and we're going into winter now. That's why it's important to have more than a vaccine, to be using all the approaches we have to try and reduce transmission.
Those cases, though, are coming down, a 9.5% change on a 7-day average from the 1st of November. Why do you think that is?
Well, we've been on a trend. First of all, just remind listeners that actually the trend has been upwards since September, and it's only in the last week or so that we've seen a bit of a downturn or flattening out. There are several possibilities. One is we've had half term. A lot of the infection is in school children, and of course, when they're away on half term, they have fewer numbers of contacts. So that's one reason. The other reason, of course, they've been building up their immunity, both because a lot of them have had infection, but also because of the vaccine campaign. So I think we've got to watch now very carefully to see what happens as schools reopen, because all the time we're looking almost in the rear looking behind us, because we're always a bit behind with the data, obviously, because we're looking.
But who are we most concerned about here? And when we're obviously watching case numbers, but
yes,
we're not going to prevent people from being able from not getting it always. People are going to end up getting this thing.
Correct.
And there's a much lower risk of young children getting it very seriously badly, meaning that they would need hospitals. So when we talk about watching it very carefully, cases may well rise and they may well go back up, but if it's not transferring onto those people who pose a greater risk to the NHS, are you content to have that high caseload?
Well, if you look at the ONS figures, you'll see that we're seeing mainly rises in children. That was the overwhelming numbers. But actually, if you look at the ONS surveys, which are the best surveys because they're a random sample of the population, the rates, the prevalence in older adults is beginning to go up as well. I mean, it's still much lower than it is in children, but it is going up in these groups, as you imagine inevitably it would do. So that's why it's so important that those people who are eligible for boosters do get the boosters, because that's a vulnerable group. And then, of course, we have the vaccination programme for children as well. And in addition, because winter is a challenge, remember, it's not just COVID, but all the other winter challenges, getting those flu vaccine rates up high is very, very important as well.
Yeah. And just finally, I wonder if you think the fact that cases have dropped. I completely appreciate the point about the trend has been going up, but they have started to come down relatively recently. Do you think that means that the government were right not to go to Plan B?
Well, I think Plan B is still very much, as I understand it, that Plan B is still in consideration. We're only at the beginning of winter, and I think if we want to avoid any restrictions in the future, or indeed reduce the damage, we need to think about all the things that we can do, which include not just vaccinating, but not just getting vaccinated, which is very important, but also remembering to isolate when we're sick, get tested when people are sick in the home. Remember, a lot of people get infected in their homes. Trying to reduce transmission in the home is also very important. So all these things we can continue to do, and all those things are going to reduce the risk of having to go to Plan B.
And masks in schools, do you think schools should consider bringing that back?
Well, that's a complicated issue in schools, because there are all sorts of considerations about the best ways that schools can run. But I think more generally, we're seeing a real reduction in use in mask wearing, for example, in public transport or in crowded indoor spaces. Those are all things that people can usefully do to protect themselves and to protect others. So I think all these things can have an effect.
Very good to speak to you. Thank you for your time. Professor Dame Johnson, you're President of the Academy of Medical Sciences, a member of SAGE. Christine, you've been waiting very patiently to get on the radio. Thanks for holding on. Your thoughts on what we've seen this week?
Well, as I say, ordinary people like me, I'm a 69-year-old pensioner, I've got more things to worry about, to pay my electricity bill and, whether I can buy food or whatever, than worrying about politicians and what they've done with, sleaze and all this stuff. Climate change, that's another thing. I've got storage heaters. I don't know if, I've got storage heaters. They're rubbish. Honestly, their absolute electric storage heating is rubbish. I don't know.
Well, listen, Christine, on the climate change, I completely take your point about there are bigger things for people to have to deal with in their day-to-day lives, and I think that on that climate change piece is a big part of it. Listen, thank you for the call. Nick's in Kings Lynn. Hi, Nick.
Yeah, hello. Well, that woman there indirectly makes my point. You were asking, will voting habits change as a result of what's happened? Well, I can say categorically, quite confidently and regretfully, no, they won't, because it just highlights how British politics has declined morally and socially over the last 20 years, that people will still vote for politicians regardless of what egregious behaviour that they're up to. And this really is all boils down to the lack of opposition in British politics. The fact that John Major has to be the only main person to come out and attack the government, the Tory government.
To be fair, I think Keir Starmer has been on the attack. I mean, he's been describing it as corrupt. That's a strong term for a former lawyer to use, the term corrupt, to describe the government's actions. Maybe for whatever reason it's just not cutting through. It doesn't seem like it's cut through with you. Nick, thank you very much indeed. We move on. After the news at 12, I'm afraid there's been the most grotesque and disgusting case of a man called David Fuller and what he did over a period of years in a hospital mortuary.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 12 o'clock, Labour is calling for the Prime Minister to resign over his handling of the Owen Paterson lobbying row. The party's shadow leader of the House of